Some of us can move objects with our minds.
You're a second-generation mover.
Is that what the kids are calling it these days?
Others can make their thoughts your own.
Get the hell out of my head!
Some can see the future.
You're a watcher.
What's going on, YouTube? This is Venomous Media, back with another video. 2009 was an interesting year for film. We saw a lot of animation and family films, as well as a successful revamp, and a lot of mixed bags, and just straight up awful adaptations of beloved IPs. And if you've been watching my channel, you will know I'm here for the comic and superhero movies. And if we're including both theatrical and DVD, as well as original movies not based on comics, but have superhero themes, or can be classified as a superhero movie, I will count it, and it will be eligible for a retrospect. So in 2009, that means we got 11 comic and or superhero movies, both live action and animated. Right off the bat, 3 of them were animated DC films released straight to DVD. And on the topic of straight to DVD animated stuff, Rob Zombie even made an animated feature based on a comic he called The Haunted World of El Superbeasto. So if you want me to cover it, let me know down below. So that's it for the animated stuff that year. The remaining 7 were live action films, but one of them did not hit theaters. I'm talking about Defender, starring Woody Harrelson and Kat Dennings. Comment down below if you'd like me to revisit it in one of my future retrospects. And while the remaining 6 did hit theaters, unfortunately, none of them were really box office hits. However, one of them is considered one of the best adaptations of a comic to date, and did get critical acclaim. I'm talking about Watchmen, which got praised for the acting, and Zack Snyder almost flawlessly bringing to life Alan Moore's dark superhero tale to the big screen. And the good news is that Watchmen was able to become successful in the home media department, but unfortunately, the remaining films I'm about to mention weren't so lucky. First, there was G.I. Joe: The Rise of Cobra, and I will admit, I enjoyed it, in a dumb, fun kind of way, kind of like the first 2 Bay Transformer movies. And I do agree with most people that Storm Shadow and Snake Eyes were definitely the highlight of the movie. Then there was X-Men Origins Wolverine, and that was another guilty pleasure for me. Sure, the timeline was a bit messed up, and we got Baraka Pool, but I still kind of liked it, mainly because of Hugh Jackman as Wolverine and Liev Schreiber's standout performance as Sabretooth. The next 2 movies I'm going to mention, most people probably don't know they were based on a comic. First, there was Whiteout with Kate Beckinsale, based on a miniseries by Greg Rucka, and the Bruce Willis movie, Surrogates, based on a comic by Robert Venditti. Both movies bombed and were panned. Anyway, if you want me to do a retrospect of them, let me know. And the last superhero movie on this list isn't based on a comic, and is actually the subject of today's video. I'm talking about Push, which starred Chris Evans, 2 years before the world got to see him hold the red, white, and blue shield. Push was a box office bomb, and was torn apart by critics. While many of them did praise the cast for their performances, their criticism was mainly that they didn't understand the story and were confused most of the movie. Even though it struck out at the box office and got panned by critics, it has gained a following over the years after its run in theaters. Some actually really remember enjoying this movie. Anyway, let's get into this. Chris Evans, you know him and you love him. Whether you first saw him in Not Another Teen Movie, or in any one of his comic and superhero roles, which include obviously Johnny Storm in Fantastic Four, which was another role that put him on the map, as well as Casey Jones in the 2007 animated TMNT movie, Jensen in The Losers, which I've already did a retrospect of if you haven't watched it, Lucas Lee in Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, and of course Captain America. However, he did hit a few bumps on his journey to being a megastar. With the exception of Not Another Teen Movie, which was his most successful film up to this point in his career, none of the other movies he did were mega hits. And that's not to say that they were bad, they just weren't successful. And as far as his comic movies go, the first Fantastic Four movie did well enough, and his portrayal of Johnny Storm was one of the highlights of the movie, and it did help give him more exposure as an actor. But the next Fantastic Four, Rise of the Silver Surfer, was a financial failure, and the plans for Fantastic Four 3 were scraped. And of course today we all know 2011 was his year in film. Like I mentioned earlier, we were back in 2009, so we still have a full 2 years before the world would see Chris Evans become Captain America. And of course there's 2010 where he did Scott Pilgrim vs. the World and The Losers, but I can get those out the way quickly. Scott Pilgrim wasn't a box office hit, but it has gained a large following over the years and is still going strong to this day. And The Losers wasn't a hit either, but I personally enjoyed it, and again, I did a retrospect if you want to check it out. Anyway, back to the year 2009, Chris Evans was still on the road to becoming a household name, and the next opportunity for him came in the form of Push, another superhero movie for him, after previously starring in the Fantastic Four movies. And at one point, Channing Tatum was actually set to star in this movie, but ultimately the role went to Chris Evans. His co-stars include Dakota Fanning, Camilla Bell, Ming-Na Wen, Cliff Curtis, Corey Stoll, and rounding up the cast was Digimon Hanzo. The director was Paul McGilligan, who had previously directed Lucky Number 11, as well as another Josh Hartnett movie, Wicker Park. The writer was David Bowerla, whose work includes Yesterday's Target, starring Daniel Baldwin and Malcolm McDowell. Bowerla also directed some of those thumb shorts that would parody popular movies. Anyway, now that the cast and crew are out the way, let's get into the premise. Since the 1940s, government factions from around the world have been experimenting on people with powers to turn them into weapons. Those individuals are divided into 8 groups. First, movers, who can move objects with their minds. Then, pushers, who can control other people's thoughts. Watchers, who can see into the future. Sniffs, who can track people's scents. Shifters, who can change into different objects. Bleeders, who can let out powerful screams. Wipers, who can wipe out memories clean. And Stitchers, who can heal people. Now, some of these superpowered beings have joined forces with the government in their experiments. The government is trying to make these beings even more powerful with a drug that they've developed. But so far, all the test subjects they've tried it on have died. And the next test subject they had lined up was a young woman named Kira Hudson, who's a pusher. But somehow Kira managed to escape the lab she was in with the drug, and she's being hunted by a government agent named Henry Carver, who's also a pusher. Then in Hong Kong, there's an American mover named Nick Gant, who had been on the run since he was a kid from the government, with his father, another mover, who was killed by Agent Carver. While in Hong Kong, Nick is using his powers to gamble, but unfortunately, they haven't been able to help him much, and he owes a lot of money. And while heading back to his home, Nick runs into 2 government agents, who are sniffs, and they manage to track his scent to Hong Kong, and they inform him about the young female pusher who escaped the lab with the drug. And after the agents leave, Nick then meets a teenage watcher named Cassie, who also tells him about the young woman. The 2 are then pursued by some triad, who happen to be bleeders. Meanwhile, the 2 agents that visited Nick then find Kira, but she manages to escape. And after escaping the bleeders, Nick and Cassie meet a few more superpowered beings that are allies, and eventually find Kira, who was actually Nick's ex-girlfriend before she was captured by the government. Now that all 3 of them are together, they agree to help each other out in their battle against the government. So that was the premise. Now I usually talk about the source material after I give the premise, but since this is an original movie and not based on a comic, I'll have to skip that and talk about the different aspects of the movie, from the action, effects, and the good and bad. So as far as the premise goes, the government hunting down superpowered individuals and trying to turn them into super weapons isn't exactly new. Honestly, that sounds like any premise or subplot for a story in a superhero comic. But I think overall they still managed to tell a compelling story with unique characters. I like that there are different categories of these beings, as well as some of them joining forces with the government. And as far as the characters go, I think they're all really well written. Like Nick, for example. He comes across as a punk and a very flawed individual at first glance, which honestly you can sympathize with him, given the life he's had to live since his father was killed by the government and he's been on the run ever since he was a little kid. But still, he means well and has a sense of humanity and is willing to keep Cassie and Kira safe, even if it means risking his own life. And Cassie might come across as a brat at times, but again, you understand why, because she sees the future, mainly chaos and death, which is a lot for a person to go through, especially a young teenager. And of course, we all want to see Kira escape the government successfully after all the experiments that were being performed on her. And I also think Carver is a great villain too. He's powerful, brutal, and calculated, and doesn't care that Kira's a fellow pusher. He's willing to make sure the government experiments happen. And I really love the effects and action scenes for this movie too. Seeing all the powers in the movie is really awesome, from the movers, pushers, and bleeders. And I feel there's enough action throughout the movie to keep moviegoers satisfied. And I also like how some of the characters, despite having powers, do use firearms instead of fully relying on their abilities. That honestly shows that the powers have limitations, and there's never a moment where I feel like any of the characters are Gary or Mary Sue's. I honestly feel with this movie that there are moments where the characters are very vulnerable, where it seems like they're down and out. Something I think more movies honestly need to show, because there's nothing compelling about a Mary or Gary Stu who seem to have an answer for any and everything. And this, I feel, makes the characters relatable to a degree. Because honestly, we probably would act this way too if we had these abilities and were being hunted by the government. And there are some twists and turns you may or may not see coming with this movie. I also really like the tone of this movie too. It's not like a conventional superhero movie where it's fun and colorful. It's more serious in tone, and a tad bit gritty. No, it's not The Dark Knight, but it's more serious than most of the MCU movies. And I think the movie did a great job with its pacing. It's not too fast or too slow. It doesn't take long before the movie gets going. And we have enough info about the plot and characters without anything dragging or prolonging until mid-second or the final act. And as far as the acting goes, I think everyone did a great job, which isn't a shock given the talent in this movie. And I really do think Chris Evans was the standout in this movie, which isn't a shock because he's always the standout in comic and superhero projects. The reason he stands out, because Nick Gant isn't the typical Chris Evans role that we have seen over the years. Maybe at first glance, sure, but this role is honestly one of his more serious roles. And a lot of people have said it wasn't until Captain America where he showed range and that they could take him seriously as an actor. But for me, it was this role. And speaking of Captain America, if I was the casting director, I would have probably picked Chris Evans for the role based on his performance here. Of course, after he did Push, he played Jensen in The Losers and Lucas Lee in Scott Pilgrim, which did show him stepping back into his usual type of role. But again, I think in addition to Push as a whole being underrated, Chris Evans' performance here is overlooked. I think he had great chemistry with the cast, especially with Dakota Fanning. They have an older brother-younger sister dynamic going on. Now, I couldn't find any information about whether this was intended to be the start of a franchise, and I don't want to spoil the ending, but I will say there aren't any cliffhangers or anything that wasn't resolved by the end, but the ending definitely leaves room for more stories. But if there were plans for sequels, they likely didn't happen because the movie bombed. And I do have my own theories why it bombed. Just like in my retrospect of the other Chris Evans film, The Losers, I said that one bombed because of the lack of marketing and star power, and I mentioned it wouldn't be until the coming years where the actors from The Losers would become household names. That's honestly the case here. Yes, you had known actors in the cast, but none of them could sell a movie with their name during this time period. And now, of course, Chris Evans is a much bigger name now. Also, Paul McGilligan wasn't a big-name director either, but he has since been able to work as a director and producer in prominent TV shows after Push. Also, as far as superhero stuff goes, this was a new IP. It didn't have brand name recognition like Superman, Batman, or Spider-Man. Another thing, as far as being a superhero movie goes, when moviegoers probably saw the trailer for this, they probably thought it wasn't up to standards with that of the Dark Knight movies or the first two Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies, so they probably passed on it. And to add to this, moviegoers probably thought this was something that would have been epic in the late 90s or early 2000s, but seeing this in 2009, they probably thought it was outdated. But like I mentioned earlier, thankfully Push has managed to gain a following over the years. Now, DC did release a 6-part comic series in their Wildstorm line that acts as a prequel to Push, which gave us a better look at the government side of things within the Push universe, as well as seeing more superpowered beings. But the only character in the movie to appear was Carver. However, the series ends with him planning a trip to Hong Kong, which is where the movie takes place. It's a fun read and shows honestly that this could have been a franchise. And years later, we did get a couple somewhat similar films to Push, like the 2012 film Chronicle, which starred Michael B. Jordan and Dane DeHaan, which surprisingly made over $100 million on a $15 million budget. And I know there's a lot of people that liked it, and I remember thinking when I first watched Chronicle that it was just okay. But I might do a rewatch so I can add this to my retrospect count, since this would be classified as a superhero film. So comment down below if you want me to do a retrospect of Chronicle. Then in 2020, there was the Netflix movie Project Power, which starred Jamie Foxx and Joseph Gordon-Levitt. Another movie I thought that was alright, but nothing special. But if you want me to do a retrospect of that one as well, let me know down below. And I do think Push was the best movie of the three because I was much more invested in the characters and story in Push compared to Chronicle and Project Power. And we all know in 2011, Chris Evans went on to play Captain America. Also, Digimon Hanzo would play Kareth the Pursuer in the MCU. Corey Stoll would go on to play Yellow Jacket and MODOK in the Ant-Man movies. And Ming-Na would go on to play Agent Melinda May in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about Push. Have any of you seen it? If so, what do you like about it? If not, what didn't you like about it? Should it have been more successful and become a franchise? Let me know down below. Also, comment down below if you have any ideas for my next retrospect. Also, make sure you comment, like, and subscribe. This is Venomous Media signing off.